Okay, everyone, this is the Chapter 14 overview, and this will be fairly brief as well, which I'm sure some of you will be happy to hear because we are getting down to the last 2 weeks of class. This chapter focuses on health and illness, and so I'm again going to just focus on some of the more, to me, the more important concepts. So I'll begin with when we think about health and illness. For sociologists, when we think about health or we think about illness, we consider those to be social constructs. So you may remember from earlier chapters, for example, when we talked about race or we talked about gender, I mentioned that these are concepts that are socially constructed, which mean that these concepts mean what society says they mean. So we think about health. Not everybody agrees on what health is. Medical doctors likely agree, but those of us who are not doctors, what we might call lay people, the masses, what do we think is health? Do we think that somebody is unhealthy because they never exercise? Or do we think that somebody's healthy only if they exercise, and if only if they exercise every day for an hour? Or is it somewhere in between? I think if you find, 4 or 5 people around you, family or coworkers or friends, and you ask them, what is health? What does a healthy person look like to you? What does it mean to you to say that a person is healthy? What are the criteria? They'd all have different criteria. Again, socially constructed. What does health mean? What does it mean to be a healthy person? The same is true with illness. What does it mean to be ill? Now, some things are readily identifiable. If somebody is coughing and sneezing and, looks like hell, well, then it's probably easy to say, okay, well, that person's ill. But how many of us have seen someone get out of a car that just, the driver just parked in the blue parking and should have a disabled, placard for persons with disabilities, and does, or even a license plate, and yet that person gets out of the car and walks into the store and looks fine to us. We may think to ourselves, oh, that person is just, lied to get the placard or to get the license plate. But maybe that person has a disability that we don't know about, that isn't readily visible, such as depression or bipolar disorder, etc. So again, what is illness? What is health? Socially constructed. And again, people put different meanings into what it means to be different meanings and different importance into what it means to be healthy, or how important it is to them to avoid getting ill. I was at a kid's birthday party several years ago. Actually, it was probably more like 5 or 6 years ago now. And I remember there was a gentleman there who I was surprised when he told me how old he was at the time. He was 60 years old, and he was looking at 5 more years of working. And I'd seen him moving around the party. It was, as I said, a child's birthday party for my brother-in-law's child. And he moved slowly and with a limp, and but he smoked and he drank. And so at one point I found myself talking to him, and I mentioned my age, which I think at that point I was like 50 maybe, or I don't know, 52, 53, something like that. I mean, I was in my early 50s. And he said, wow, I wouldn't have thought you were that old. And I said, well, I really try to stay healthy. And he said, yeah, I'm 60, and let me tell you, if I'd known I was going to live this long, I would have taken better care of myself. And I think he meant it as a joke. At least I laughed because it seemed funny to me. But I wonder if he was also serious to some degree, that if he had known he was going to live that long, that he would have taken better care of himself. And I think that that's something that people sometimes realize at a point when they know they're unhealthy, and they realize, maybe I should do something to become healthier. So again, socially constructed. Let me move this up here. All right, so 2 kinds of illnesses: acute illness or acute disease, and chronic illness or chronic disease. Acute means that it is something that has a sudden onset, and it might be even briefly incapacitating, and it might even be curable, or it might be fatal. Okay, so a heart attack, for example, is an acute disease. It's something that comes on quickly. It is incapacitating while you are experiencing the heart attack, and the doctors might be able to cure you. You know, maybe they find that your heart valves are um, at diminished capacity and they have to do a bypass, quadruple or double bypass or whatever it might be. So they've got to put new valves in your heart. Or maybe you get to the hospital too late or nobody finds you and it's fatal and you die from the heart attack. Chronic diseases are things that generally develop slowly over time to the point that we don't know that we are developing them until we are not feeling well, we go to the doctor, tests are performed, and then that's when we find out we have something such as type 2 diabetes, which is adult onset diabetes, or maybe we have high blood pressure, chronic high blood pressure, or our cholesterol is too high. You know, these are what are considered to be chronic illnesses. These are things that took a long time before they showed themselves, um, because it takes a long time, sometimes, you know, for many of these, for you to get to the point where you are diabetic. Now, often people aren't feeling well and they go to the doctor and they're told, well, you're pre-diabetic, which means, hey, you are heading toward developing diabetes. However, if you do certain things, you could prevent that from happening. Um, I've known people who were pre-diabetic and subsequently became diabetic because they didn't do enough to stave off that chronic illness. But again, it's all up to each of us to decide how much effort we're going to put into staying healthy, or whatever our version of healthy is. Now I'm going to focus on the three perspectives here: structural functionalist, conflict, and symbolic interactionist theory. So for structural functionalist theorists, when they look at disease, when they look at illness, they focus on the idea that, okay, you know, to have disease within a widespread disease within society is bad. Many people will get sick, maybe even die. The pandemic is a good example of that. However, structural functionalist theorists, they look at, say, the pandemic that we are experiencing, and they believe that we will learn from this pandemic, that we will be able to figure out a way to heal people, to treat COVID-19. And indeed, we, meaning society, but in particular Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, these pharmaceutical companies created vaccines. And at least two of them, the Pfizer, BioNTech, and the Moderna vaccines, are said to be around 95% effective, which is huge. Most of the epidemiologists and medical doctors last year in 2020, when Operation Warp Speed was started by President Trump, in, I believe it was April or May of last year, most people thought, wow, we'll be really lucky if we can get one within a year, and we'll be really lucky if we can get one that's even 65–70% effective. And it was done in less than a year, and at least two of them are around 95% effective. So for structural functionalist theorists, they say, yes, disease is bad for society. However, especially when it becomes widespread like a pandemic. However, society, the social institutions will step in to figure out how to combat this widespread illness. And we did that. We did that with the vaccine. Now, of course, I am making this on July 18th, 2021, and throughout the United States, just about every state, with the exception, I think, 4 or 5, with the exception of those 4 or 5, all the other states are experiencing an increase in COVID cases. So we were looking good for up until about late June, and then most states, including California, as you know, those of you who are in California, California opened June 15th, and on July 17th at midnight, well, I guess it would be then Sunday, July 18th at midnight, the mask mandate was reinstituted, was reimposed if you are indoors, even for vaccinated people. Why? Because we've got a variant out there that is very contagious. Also, though, I want to point to the chronic illnesses, because for functionalist theorists, they look at chronic illness. And again, they focus on, well, how does society then learn to adapt by treating these chronic illnesses so that people can live more full lives and live longer? And again, medical science has done that. There used to not be treatments for high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. People would die from these things at early ages. Now, you can treat these things. You may have to take a medication every day or inject yourself every day, but you can treat these things. And some people live many years after their diagnosis, as long as they stay on their medication and maybe try to change some of their habits. Conflict theorists focus on, again, power and money and access to resources. So for conflict theorists, when they look at the American healthcare system, they see that there are really two types of healthcare in the United States. There's the healthcare for wealthy people that wealthy people can easily access. They don't have to care about or think about costs. They can have a private room in the hospital rather than a shared room. That there are people, they can even have what are known as concierge doctors who will go to your home, and you pay a fee. Of course, you pay a lot more, but you don't have to go to a doctor's office and sit amongst the proletariat, the masses. On the other hand, there are many people who may have some health coverage, but it may not be very good, and they may have to be concerned about what procedures they get and whether or not they can afford their copayment. And then there are people who are underinsured. Well, there are people who are insured. They don't have to worry too much. They can pretty much cover their healthcare costs unless something catastrophic happens, like they get cancer and it keeps coming back and they have really expensive treatments. They might max out. Then there are the underinsured people who have some insurance but maybe not enough. They really have to be concerned about whether or not they go to the doctor when they have an ache or a pain. And then there are the uninsured. These are people who have no insurance at all and who generally wait until they are doubled over in pain, and maybe even on death's doorstep before they get taken to a hospital. And so the other thing about healthcare in the United States is that the people in power can try to do a lot to shape the laws that define who has coverage and what kind of coverage they have. And for those of you who pay some attention to what goes on in the United States, the Affordable Care Act was passed by Congress in 2010. Barack Obama signed it into law in 2010. The Affordable Care Act made a lot of changes to the way healthcare is provided in the United States. Not enough, but it made some good changes. Since the day it was passed and signed into legislation, the Republicans in Congress, in both the House and the Senate, have said we are going to repeal and replace, and that became their catchphrase for the 2012 elections. Repeal and replace. Those were the midterm elections. Repeal and replace, repeal and replace. Didn't happen. Then in 2016, repeal and replace, repeal and replace. Even then President Trump, while he was candidate Trump, talked about, one of the first things he was going to do is repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. Here we are in 2021, and that has never happened. In fact, the Republicans have never offered up an alternative to the Affordable Care Act. They've always said, well, once we repeal it, then we're going to figure out what we're going to do. Well, that seems like a pretty stupid plan to me, and I'm not a legislator, I'm just a lawyer. But it seems to me almost anything that you're going to do, if you already have something in place and you're saying, I'm going to get rid of this, I'm going to replace it with something, you should have a pretty damn good plan for what you're going to replace it with. Because if you take it out and then you don't replace it with something, then you've got this huge gap. And and people are going to suffer because you didn't plan. So, and I think that's true with anything, that we do in life. If you've got something going and you want to replace it, then you should have a good plan for how you're going to replace that before you just take it out and there's this gap. Also, for conflict theorists, again, they focus on, how do we identify people who are worthy of our sympathy when they're sick? We tend to think of certain illnesses or diseases as people bringing these things on themselves because of their own actions, but other people we have a great deal of sympathy for. So think about the difference between somebody who's an alcoholic or somebody who is an opioid addict. We tend to have far less sympathy for somebody who brought this on themselves than we do for the person who finds out that he or she has cancer or has, I don't know. Well, see, but that's where it's tricky because for conflict theorists, they say, again, social construction. One could even make the argument, I won't, but one could make the argument that for a lot of diseases, particularly chronic diseases like diabetes or high cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, not type 1, type 2 diabetes, adult onset diabetes, or heart disease, or high blood pressure, etc. That some of these things were brought on themselves by people because they didn't exercise, they didn't eat very well, they didn't take care of themselves, maybe they drank too much, maybe they ate too much fast food, etc., etc. For conflict theorists, they say it's often people who are poor or who are working class who are viewed as unworthy of our sympathy because we think, well, these people, they didn't take care of themselves, they brought this on themselves, they smoked, they drank, they ate fast food, etc. But these people over here, these are the good people because they took care of themselves and they still got cancer, so we should be more sympathetic toward them. So again, for conflict theorists, looking at who labels people worthy or unworthy of our sympathy, but also looking at how we have structured healthcare in the United States and how wealthy people can pretty much get any treatment they need or want, whereas others really have to struggle to decide, do I really go to the doctor? Maybe I should just wait. And then symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism is focused on, again, how we give meaning, the social construct of what it means to be healthy or what it means to be ill. And much of the way we construct meanings for health and illness depend on historically how we have thought of certain illnesses, certain diseases, but also partly culturally and situational contexts. So, for example, historically, we as a society have viewed cancer as something that isn't anybody's fault, unless of course, again, you're a smoker and you get throat cancer. Well, then somebody might say, well, see, you shouldn't have smoked. I don't think that's very empathetic, but there are people who would say something like that. The cultural context here, I want you to consider how in many ethnic cultures talking about mental illness is something that just is frowned upon. In fact, in some families, you just can't talk about mental illness, which is unfortunate because for families, for ethnic families, if there's a person who's acting weird or strange, we often chalk that up to that person's just being hard-headed or that person's just being lazy, etc., without really thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe this person has an undiagnosed mental health issue. And maybe we should actually encourage this person to go to a doctor to get a mental health evaluation. I'm thinking here of a guy who, you guys won't know this because this is, an old movie by your standards. But the movie is called The Soloist, and it was based on the true story of a friendship that was struck up between a homeless man who was a brilliant musician, I believe he played the cello. His name was Nathaniel, and a LA Times opinion writer, columnist. And the writer met the homeless man playing the cello because one day he was trying to think of, he had a deadline to meet, so he was in Pershing Square, which is a place where a lot of homeless people hang out near downtown LA, or in downtown LA. And so he was sitting there, trying to, the writer was sitting there trying to think of, well, what can I write about? I got a deadline. And he heard this beautiful classical music, and he wondered, well, where's that coming from? And so he followed the sound, and he found this homeless man playing a cello that instead of 5 strings only had 3, but it still was beautiful. And so long story short, over time, he kept going back and eventually started talking to the guy, and they became friends. And what had apparently happened to this man, Nathaniel, who was now homeless, was that he was a brilliant musician. He had a lot of potential as a young person. He got into the Juilliard School of Performing Arts in New York City, which is one of the highest ranked schools for performing arts in the world. But he was kicked out of school because he was acting weird, and the other students were afraid of him. He's also African American. So then he went to his sister's home and was staying with her in the basement. But her husband wasn't all that happy about it because he was weird. And then one night they went out to dinner, and when they came back, they found the fire department at their home. And the basement had caught on fire because Nathaniel had accidentally started a fire. And so at that point, the husband said, "Oh, no more. He can't stay with us anymore. It's just getting dangerous." And so he then was effectively out on the streets, and eventually he made his way to LA because the weather's better. But it turns out that the writer was able to convince him over time to go to a doctor and to be seen for a physical. And in the process of getting the physical, the doctor also recognized that there were possible mental health issues, and Nathaniel agreed to be evaluated, and it turned out that he was schizophrenic. He didn't know that, had never been diagnosed as schizophrenic, and he agreed to go on medication. When he went on medication, he got better, but he found he wasn't as creative. And so he stopped taking his medicine because he would rather be creative with his music than to be like us. So again, thinking about what kind of meanings do we attach to things like mental health, who's mentally healthy, and whether we can even talk about mental health, whether we can even talk about health with the people around us. For a lot of, well, I'm speaking from only my experience around more traditional Latinx individuals, they don't like to talk about health. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about going to get a checkup. They don't want to talk about going to the dentist, which of course your dental health is very much connected with your physical health. They don't want to talk about any of this stuff. I feel fine. That's, Latinx older people. That's their answer to everything. Which tells you, I don't want to talk about this. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. I'm walking away. So again, culturally, how do we think about health and illness? Do we even talk about it? And then the situational contexts. Are we considered healthy when we're around certain people, but maybe not around others? That could be the case. For example, I've been a runner all my life and have worked out and been very active all my life. And so to some older or more traditional Latinx individuals, I'm too thin. I need to put on weight. But when I'm around more mainstream people, people that are not old school Latinx people, they think I'm healthy. They comment on, oh, you're so lean, etc. And so I think in a lot of situations, it does somewhat depend on where we are and who we are with, the situational context, in terms of whether we're thought to be healthy or not. All right, so then I do want to just focus on the social inequality um, of health and illness. And the three factors that are discussed in some detail in the text are socioeconomic status, racial inequalities, and I'll add racial and ethnic inequalities, and gender inequalities. First, with socioeconomic status, I've mentioned this earlier in this video, that we really have three different worlds when it comes to healthcare in this country. We've got the people who are quite wealthy and they can pretty much get whatever healthcare they want and need and not have to think about it. Then you've got people in the middle, who typically middle class people who have health insurance. For the most part, they feel fairly comfortable they can handle a medical crisis or a health crisis. And then you've got the people who are underinsured that don't feel very well and figure I better, stay as healthy as I can because these co-payments are ridiculous. But they've got it just in case. And then you've got the uninsured. And so it should not be any surprise that people who are wealthier not only are healthier by the mainstream societal standards, but they also generally live longer, and they typically feel better and look better as they age than people who are from much lower socioeconomic statuses. So I probably don't have to point that out to you, but I would again just say that there are times when I'm talking to somebody and somebody says, "Oh, young lady," and it's an older person, a person older than I am. And I say, "Oh, I'm not so young. I'm 59." And they say, "Oh, well, I'm 62," or "Oh, I'm 59 too," etc. And they're surprised. They're surprised to find out that I'm their age or only slightly younger than they are. But I also think it's partly because we've aged differently, simply because I wouldn't call myself a wealthy person, but I am a higher income person. And so I've been able to make different choices in regard to what I eat and how I live and what I make important to myself in terms of my health than somebody else with far fewer resources and money. Racial inequalities, ethnic inequalities. The pandemic has really highlighted how much difference there is when doctors are treating people who are ethnic versus those who are not ethnic, particularly when that doctor is non-ethnic. And so what we see, of course, is that even though early on when the vaccine first became widely available in, say, late January, February, most of the people who were getting it were people over age 65, right? That was the first group, and healthcare workers. And then the next group, and the next group, and the next group. But what we found was, even when it was more widely available to people, not everyone was able to get a vaccine, either because they lived too far away from a health facility that was offering it, and then even when CVS and Walgreens started providing the shots, there still wasn't a place nearby for them to go. And we tend to forget about this because you're living in the metropolitan LA area, most of you, but there are many places in the United States that are quite rural. And so to get to the nearest town is 25, 30 miles, and particularly if you are on a Native American reservation that doesn't have a lot of resources, it may be more difficult to get to a place for you to actually get the vaccine. So it's very, or also, I wish I'd found this and thought about finding it, but there was a doctor, African American doctor, who became ill with COVID during the early part of the pandemic last March. And she was hospitalized, she was intubated, ultimately she did make it. But after she was no longer intubated and was able to speak again, she was very vocal about the fact that she wasn't treated in the way that she'd seen many whites in that hospital treated. For example, when she started feeling ill, she was told by her supervisor, "Well, you're probably just coming down with the flu, you should go home and rest." she wasn't immediately tested for COVID-19, even though she's working in a hospital where they had many COVID-19 patients. And my spouse often says this when, because we have Kaiser, which I like Kaiser, and a lot of people have complaints about it, but I like Kaiser. But I've found that no matter which healthcare you have, which health insurance you have to be your own advocate. You have to ask the questions. You have to come prepared with a set of questions about whatever illness or problem brought you to the doctor. And you sometimes have to be a little forceful um, with your request and say, well, I'd like a second opinion then. Because if you don't, it's your life, not the doctor's life, that may be negatively impacted. And then finally, gender inequalities. We've known for a long time that gender inequalities exist in medicine. For example, early on, much of the research that was done regarding heart attacks and strokes was done on men. And early on, many of the drugs that we use to treat heart disease the clinical trials were done using men, particularly white men. And so we know that women get strokes. We know that women have heart attacks. And so the problem was a lot of the research and the dosages that were recommended because of that research on mostly white men didn't necessarily work for women. Women's bodies are different. Not only is their physiology different, so is their physiology, meaning the hormones in their bodies, but so are their body types. So we need to recognize, and medicine has now started realizing, okay, we need to get women in trials, and we need to start figuring out dosages for women because women don't necessarily need the same dosage that men do. But the other thing is that in this society, and this is partly focusing on some of the information from Chapter 9, women are expected to be able to do everything. Okay? And so women may feel that they should first take care of, work if they have it work outside of home, and then the home and the kids and the partner, and they may not focus as much on their own health, which means that they may be chronically ill and just get used to feeling like shit. But really, whatever illness they have could potentially be treated, but because they're so busy taking care of everyone else, they don't make appointments for themselves. Women are also typically more likely to develop mood and anxiety disorders. So panic attacks, chronic depression, etc. And they may feel bad about not being able to do all the things that they are supposed to do according to societal standards. So that's it for chapter 14. I will see you next week for the last chapters, because next week is our last chapter.